Report 1. Night guard at the factory. A man named Marcus, a fictitious name to preserve his privacy, who, in mid-2019, accepted a job as a night guard at an old factory on the outskirts of Detroit. The city, once a pulsating center of the automobile industry, had suffered a sharp decline in recent decades, and many factories were abandoned, turning into skeletons of a glorious past. The factory in question was one of these decaying structures. Marcus was hired by a security company to protect the site from potential intruders or vandals. The work was solitary and monotonous, consisting of regular rounds through the vast factory grounds, checking if all doors and windows were locked and if there were no signs of break-ins. In the first few weeks, everything went without incident. Marcus spent the nights traversing the silent and dark corridors of the factory, illuminated only by the weak light of his flashlight. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps and the occasional noise of the wind howling outside. As time passed, however, Marcus began to notice strange things. He heard inexplicable sounds, like the distant hum of machines turned on, even though he knew the factory was completely shut down. Initially, he thought they were hallucinations caused by fatigue and the monotony of the work. One night, while making his usual rounds, Marcus heard a loud noise coming from one of the production areas. He cautiously approached, flashlight in hand, and realized that the sound was that of a stamping machine in full operation. The machine was hitting repeatedly, as if it were producing parts in series. Marcus was paralyzed with fear. He knew the factory was shut down, and that there shouldn't be any machines running. He approached the machine cautiously and tried to turn it off, but couldn't find any buttons or levers. The machine continued to function, emitting a deafening noise. Suddenly, Marcus saw shadows running through the production lines. They were dark and indistinct figures moving quickly between the machines. Marcus tried to follow them with the flashlight, but they were too fast and disappeared into the shadows. Amid the noise of the machines and the movement of the shadows, Marcus began to hear voices. They were indistinct shouts and whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Marcus was terrified. He didn't know what was happening, but he felt he was witnessing something supernatural. Marcus ran out of the production area and back to the guardhouse. He locked the door and called his supervisor, reporting what had happened. The supervisor didn't believe his story and said he was probably imagining things. Marcus insisted that he wasn't lying and begged the supervisor to send someone to check the factory. The supervisor agreed but said it would take a few hours for someone to arrive at the site. Marcus was left alone in the guardhouse, terrified and waiting for the night to end. The following hours were the longest and scariest of his life. Marcus heard the noises from the factory, the screams and whispers, and saw shadows moving outside the guardhouse. He felt cornered and defenseless. Finally, at dawn, the supervisor arrived at the factory with another security guard. They searched the place but found nothing unusual. The machines were turned off, there were no signs of invasion, and everything seemed to be in order. The supervisor reprimanded Marcus for making up the story and threatened to fire him. Marcus tried to defend himself, but no one believed him. He felt frustrated and powerless. Marcus continued working at the factory for a few more weeks, but the strange things didn't stop. He continued to hear the noises, see the shadows, and feel the presence of something supernatural. He felt increasingly disturbed and began to have problems with sleep and anxiety. Finally, Marcus couldn't take it anymore and quit. He could no longer work in a place that terrified him so much. He preferred to be unemployed than to continue suffering. After leaving the factory job, Marcus could never forget what had happened. He researched the history of the factory and discovered that it had been the scene of several accidents and deaths over the years. He began to believe that the spirits of dead workers still haunted the place. Marcus shared his story on an online forum in hopes of finding other people who had gone through similar experiences. He received many responses from people who worked in abandoned factories and who had also witnessed strange things. He realized he wasn't alone and that there was something inexplicable happening in these places. Report 2. The train station. A man named Ricardo, an amateur radio operator with a peculiar hobby, exploring abandoned train stations, Ricardo had a fascination with these places, which he saw as time capsules, silent witnesses to a busy past full of stories. In 2014, Ricardo discovered an abandoned train station on the outskirts of a small country town. The station, once a vital connection point for the region, had been deactivated decades ago after the construction of a new highway that diverted the flow of passengers and goods. The station was in ruins, with peeling paint, broken windows, and weeds taking over the tracks. Even so, Ricardo felt a strange attraction to the place, as if something was calling him to explore it. Armed with his radio equipment and a powerful flashlight, Ricardo began to explore the station. He walked through the old waiting rooms, dusty offices, and dark tunnels leading to the tracks. At first, everything seemed normal, just an abandoned and decaying station. However, as time passed, Ricardo began to notice strange things. He heard voices whispering amid the static on his radio, as if someone was trying to communicate with him. The voices were indistinct and difficult to understand, but Ricardo had the feeling they were saying something important. He tried to tune the radio better to capture the voices more clearly, but couldn't. The static was always too strong, drowning out any attempt at communication. Besides the voices, Ricardo also began to see lights flashing in the dark tunnels. The lights were weak and intermittent, but enough to catch his attention. He tried to approach the lights to see what they were, but they always disappeared before he could get close. Ricardo began to feel a strange presence in the station. He had the sensation that he wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching him. He constantly looked behind him, but never saw anything. On one of his explorations, Ricardo decided to enter one of the tunnels leading to the tracks. The tunnel was dark and damp, with a strong smell of mold. Ricardo turned on his flashlight and began to walk through the tunnel. In the middle of the tunnel, Ricardo heard the sound of footsteps coming towards him. He stopped and pointed the flashlight ahead, but saw nothing. The footsteps continued to approach, getting faster and faster. Ricardo started running back to the entrance of the tunnel, his heart racing. He could feel the presence of someone running behind him, but couldn't see anyone. When Ricardo finally reached the entrance of the tunnel, he turned to see who or what was running behind him, but there was no one. He was alone in the dark, damp tunnel. Ricardo ran out of the station, terrified. He never returned there again. After the incident in the tunnel, Ricardo began to research the history of the abandoned train station. He discovered that the station had been the scene of a fatal accident in the past. According to local legend, a passenger train had derailed in one of the station's tunnels, killing dozens of people. The bodies of the victims were removed from the wreckage, but their spirits never left the place. Ricardo began to believe that the voices, lights, and presence he felt at the station were the spirits of the accident victims. Report 3. The gas station. In 2015, a young attendant at an isolated gas station on a rural Ohio road began experiencing inexplicable events during his night shifts. The station was located in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by vast cornfields and with little traffic, especially at night. The 23-year-old man started noticing strange things a few weeks after beginning his work on the night shift. One of the first things he noticed was a shadowy figure that seemed to appear in the corner of his eyes. Whenever he tried to look directly at it, the figure would disappear. Another recurring phenomenon was the inexplicable falling of objects from the convenience store shelves. This happened even when there were no customers in the store and no apparent vibration. The young man also reported a constant feeling of being watched, especially during the quietest hours of the early morning. The sensation was so intense that he sometimes caught himself nervously looking out the window, searching for something or someone in the dark fields surrounding the station. As the weeks passed, he began to hear strange sounds, indistinct whispers and footsteps, even when he was alone at the station. On one particularly frightening night, he swore he saw a figure quickly pass through the store's aisle, disappearing before he could identify it. The strange events seemed to intensify on full moon nights or during storms, when the station became even more isolated due to the bad weather. The attendant discovered there was a local legend about the station. According to the older residents of the area, the site had been built on an old cemetery. Although skeptical at first, he began to consider the possibility that the legend could be true, given the frequency and intensity of the strange occurrences. One night, while in the bathroom, he clearly heard the sound of the store door's bell. When he rushed out, he found no one. The security cameras showed no customer entering, but captured the moment when the door opened and closed by itself. On another occasion, he found all the magazines from the shelf scattered on the floor when he arrived for his shift, although the previous attendant swore everything was in order when he left. The events began to affect his well-being. He had difficulty sleeping and felt constantly anxious, especially in the hours leading up to his shift. The young man tried to rationalize the occurrences, considering explanations such as fatigue, the loneliness of night work, and possible structural problems in the old building. However, the frequency and nature of the events made it difficult for him to accept only rational explanations. The station owner, when informed about the events, was skeptical. He suggested that the attendant was letting his imagination run wild due to the long, solitary hours. Despite the boss's skepticism, the young man noticed that other employees avoided the night shift, preferring to work only during the day. On a particularly eventful night, he clearly saw a male figure dressed in old-fashioned clothes standing between the gas pumps. When he blinked, the figure had disappeared. After this incident, he began researching the area's history. He discovered that, decades ago, there had been a serious car accident near the site where the station was built. This discovery led him to speculate whether the strange events could be related to this accident, perhaps involving restless spirits. He also noticed that certain items in the store seemed to change places during the night, even when he was sure he hadn't moved them. The station's radio occasionally turned on by itself, always tuned to a station playing old music from the 50s. One morning, he found an enigmatic message written on the bathroom mirror, "Help us." The message quickly disappeared, as if it had never existed. As time passed, the young man began to feel that the events were not necessarily threatening, but more like attempts at communication from something or someone. He began talking out loud during his shifts, as if conversing with invisible presences, and noticed that this seemed to calm the activity. However, other incidents continued to occur, such as inexplicable fluctuations in the lights and sudden temperature changes in specific areas of the station. The attendant also reported having vivid dreams related to the station, in which he saw people dressed in clothes from past eras wandering around the place. After almost a year working at the station, he began to feel strangely comfortable with the occurrences, seeing them as part of his nightly routine. He even developed a kind of affection for the place and its supposed presences, feeling that somehow he was connected to something greater that he didn't fully understand. When he finally left the job to go to college, he felt a mixture of relief and nostalgia, knowing he was leaving behind experiences that many would consider impossible. Report 4. The Haunted Library. In 2017, an unusual event began to attract the attention of staff and patrons at an old library located in the historic center of a small town. The place, known for its imposing architecture and valuable collection, became the stage for a series of inexplicable occurrences that intrigued the local community and attracted the curiosity of paranormal enthusiasts. The library in question, built in the late 19th century was a 3-story building with extensive dark wood shelves, spiral staircases, and a stained glass dome in the central ceiling. The smell of old books and accumulated dust were striking characteristics of the environment, which housed a collection of more than 100,000 volumes, including rare works and historical manuscripts. The protagonist of this story was a middle-aged man named Arthur, who had worked as a night librarian for more than a decade. Known for his dedication and love of books, Arthur was responsible for organizing and maintaining the collection during the night shift when the library was closed to the public. It all began on an autumn night when Arthur was performing his usual routine of organizing the shelves on the second floor. The characteristic silence of the place was suddenly interrupted by an almost imperceptible whisper coming from a section dedicated to 18th century literature. Initially, Arthur attributed the sound to the wind that occasionally entered through the cracks of the old windows. However, as he approached the source of the noise, he realized that the windows were completely closed and that there was no air current in the environment. In the days that followed, the librarian began to notice a series of strange events that occurred with increasing frequency. Books seemed to change position on the shelves without anyone touching them, and the sound of pages being turned echoed through the empty corridors. A week after the first incident, Arthur was climbing the spiral staircase leading to the third floor when he heard a dull thud coming from the upper floor. Upon arriving at the scene, he found a heavy encyclopedia tome fallen on the floor, open to a random page, with no apparent explanation for its fall. The librarian, known for his skepticism and rationality, tried to find logical explanations for the events. He checked the ventilation system, inspected the shelves for instabilities, and even installed security cameras at strategic points in the library. Despite his efforts, the mysterious events continued to occur. Arthur began to feel a constant sensation of being watched, especially when working near the marble statues that adorned the corners of the main reading room. These statues, representing historical and mythological figures, seemed to follow the librarian's movements with their fixed eyes. Arthur often caught himself looking over his shoulder, hoping to catch some subtle movement in the expressions carved in stone. The growing tension caused Arthur to start sharing his experiences with coworkers. Some showed concern, while others treated the matter with skepticism or even humor. The head librarian, an elderly lady named Margaret, listened to Arthur's account seriously and revealed that similar stories had been circulating among staff for decades. Margaret told Arthur about rumors that the library had been built on the ruins of an ancient monastery, and that some of the oldest books in the collection had belonged to a religious order extinct centuries ago. These stories, although never proven, fed the aura of mystery that surrounded the place. As the days went by, Arthur began to notice patterns in the inexplicable events. The whispers and movements of books seemed more frequent in certain areas of the library, especially in the history and ancient literature sections. He began to keep a detailed diary of his observations, recording dates, times, and precise descriptions of each occurrence. On a particularly cold winter night, about 2 months after the events began, Arthur experienced what would be the apex of the strange manifestations in the library. Around 2 a.m., while cataloging a new shipment of books on the first floor, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the upper floor. Climbing the stairs cautiously, Arthur reached the second floor and was surprised by the sight that awaited him. Sitting at one of the reading tables, illuminated only by the weak light of an old lamp, was a translucent figure bent over an open book. The apparition, which resembled the silhouette of an elderly man wearing period clothing, seemed completely absorbed in reading. Arthur, paralyzed by surprise and fear, observed the scene for a few seconds before the figure raised its eyes from the book and looked directly at him. At that moment, the lamp flickered and went out, plunging the environment into darkness. When Arthur managed to turn on the main lights of the floor, the figure had disappeared, leaving only the open book on the table as evidence of its presence. The book in question was a rare 17th century poetry volume, open to a poem that spoke about eternity and the search for knowledge beyond death. Arthur, with trembling hands, photographed the page with his cell phone before carefully closing the volume and putting it back in its place on the shelf. In the days following the incident, Arthur debated with himself about how to proceed. Part of him wanted to share his experience with colleagues and even with the local press, while another part feared the consequences of such a revelation for his reputation and for the future of the library. Opting for discretion, Arthur decided to continue his observations and records, hoping to better understand the phenomena he had witnessed. He began to dedicate part of his free time to researching the history of the library and the region, looking for clues that could explain the paranormal occurrences. His research led him to discover that the land where the library had been built had a rich and sometimes turbulent history. In addition to the supposed monastery, old documents mentioned that the site had once housed a hospital during an epidemic in the 18th century, and later served as a barracks during a regional conflict in the early 19th century. These layers of history seemed to manifest in the strange occurrences of the library. Arthur began to notice that paranormal events often coincided with significant dates related to these historical periods. Meanwhile, the library's routine followed its normal course during the day. The patrons, mostly students, researchers, and literature lovers, had no idea of the events that unfolded during the night. Arthur, always discreet, maintained his professional composure, although his closest colleagues noticed a change in his behavior. Librarian Margaret Ahn, who had become Arthur's confidant, suggested that they consider the possibility of conducting more in-depth research on the library's collection. She believed that some of the oldest books might contain relevant information about the history of the place and possibly about the phenomena they were experiencing. With permission from the library management, Arthur and Margaret initiated a project to catalog and study the rarest and oldest volumes in the collection. This work, carried out mainly during night hours, provided Arthur with a new perspective on the strange events. As he delved into the ancient texts, Arthur began to develop a theory that the library was not just a repository of physical knowledge, but also a kind of spiritual archive. He speculated that the energies and memories impregnated in the books over the centuries could, somehow, manifest under certain conditions. This theory, although not scientific, offered Arthur a conceptual framework to understand his experiences. He noticed that the manifestations seemed more intense when he was working with particularly old or significant works. An intriguing aspect that Arthur observed was that the paranormal events never seemed to have a malicious or threatening nature. On the contrary, the manifestations always revolved around books and the act of reading, as if the spirits or energies present in the library were simply continuing their quests for knowledge beyond the limits of physical life. As months passed, Arthur developed a kind of routine regarding the phenomena. He learned to anticipate certain events based on patterns he had observed, and even began to feel a strange familiarity with the invisible presence that seemed to inhabit the library. However, Arthur never again had an experience as vivid as the vision of the translucent figure reading at the table. That incident remained unique in its intensity and clarity, marking a turning point in his perception of the library and his work. Arthur's experience in the ghostly library had a profound impact on his personal and professional life. Although he never publicly shared the full extent of his experiences, his attitude towards the work and the books under his care changed significantly. He began to treat each volume with even more respect and care, aware that each book could be more than just a physical object, but a container of memories, ideas, and perhaps even spiritual energy. The library, in turn, continued to be a place of study and research for the community, maintaining its reputation as a treasure trove of knowledge. The inexplicable events persisted, albeit more subtly, as a constant reminder of the mysteries that the books and the building itself held. Arthur remained as the night librarian for many years after the events of 2017, becoming an almost legendary figure among younger staff members. Although he rarely spoke about his experiences, his dedication and the look of reverence with which he treated the oldest books fueled the curiosity of those around him. As he approached retirement, Arthur began to consider the possibility of documenting his experiences more fully. He thought about compiling his diaries and observations into a manuscript, not necessarily for publication, but as a record for future guardians of the library. The story of the ghostly library and Arthur's experiences eventually became part of local folklore. Although many treated the accounts with skepticism, others viewed the library with a new look of admiration and respect, aware of the layers of history and mystery that permeated its century-old walls. Report 5. Call Center. In 2022, in São Paulo, Brazil, a peculiar event caught attention at a 24-hour call center. Located in a modern building in the city center, the call center became the focus of inexplicable occurrences that disturbed its employees. The building, constructed on land where a cemetery once stood, was filled with work cubicles and monitors that filled the floors with an atmosphere of modernity. However, the history of the place seemed to manifest in enigmatic ways. Among the many operators who worked there was Carlos, a young São Paulo native in his 20s, known for his punctuality and competence. Carlos had recently started working the night shift, an experience that proved more intense than he had imagined. In the first weeks of work, Carlos didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. However, as time passed, he began to perceive strange whispers in his headphones. Initially, he believed it was some kind of interference in the equipment. The whispers were vague and almost inaudible, but gradually began to make Carlos uneasy. He discussed the problem with some colleagues, who recommended changing headphones, thinking it was a technical issue. Carlos followed the advice and changed equipment, but the whispers persisted. This strange presence became more unsettling when, on an ordinary night, he began receiving numerous silent calls followed by low noises, as if they were murmurs or a distant wind. Other operators also began reporting similar experiences. Monica, who worked near Carlos, revealed that besides the whispers, she felt a cold presence, as if something was silently passing by her side. In addition to the auditory issues, Carlos began to feel that he was being watched. Every time he looked at the monitors, he felt as if invisible eyes were following his movements, a sensation that reverberated down his spine. The feeling of being watched intensified when he was alone on floors of the building, especially in the early hours, when the silence became deeper and more oppressive, accentuating the mysticism of the place. During a break, Carlos was encouraged to search for information on online forums and discovered reports from other call center professionals facing similar phenomena. These topics discussed voices, noises, and shadows in a manner similar to his own experience. Carlos, trying to understand what was happening, shared his discoveries with colleagues. It wasn't long before more people began reporting mysterious shadows moving between the office desks. One night, Carlos noticed a shadow quickly passing through the corridor. The fright was big, but upon investigating, he found only a dark and empty floor, except for the constant noise of computers. His colleagues also began to notice these shadows. Julia, a co-worker, described a dark figure quickly passing in the background of the office, in the break area, but found no one when she checked the place. Tension began to rise in the office when, on one occasion, all the monitors on the floor blinked simultaneously, briefly displaying distorted images before returning to normal. Technical support was called, but couldn't find significant faults that explained the phenomenon. The official explanation given was a possible electrical failure or interference. Carlos, previously skeptical, began to consider the possibility of something supernatural. He decided to talk more with his colleagues to identify patterns or affinities in the events. Observing the reports, the phenomena coincided more frequently during the early morning hours, especially between 2 and 4 a.m., a time that already carried mystical meanings in various cultures. It was during one of these early mornings that Carlos experienced the most intense situation. While attending to a call, he heard whispers reciting his name in the headphones, in a clear and haunting manner. Overwhelmed by fear, Carlos immediately removed his headphones. He looked around, but the floor was empty and silent as always, with no indication that anyone else was present. A week later, in a collective effort, the operators decided to record during the shift, hoping to capture evidence of the phenomena. Carlos and his colleagues placed a recorder near the cubicles with the most activity. When reviewing the audio the next day, they encountered mysterious noises, such as subtle knocks and whispers that revealed the presence of something inexplicable, adding new dimensions to the work routine. Intrigued by the evidence, the employees began to delve deeper into the building's history. They discovered that, besides its commercial use, the land was known to have housed a cemetery in the past. Although there were no formal records, many stories circulated about former employees who had witnessed similar phenomena, especially those more susceptible during night shifts. Such revelations fueled a curiosity mixed with fascination and fear among the team. While some still questioned the reports, others began to take everything seriously, noting the repetition of patterns. Carlos emerged as a central figure within the reports. He carefully noted his experiences, recording times, locations, and colleagues present at each incident, in an attempt to bring some clarity to the chaos. The support among co-workers was a consolation during those hours, and during breaks they always openly discussed fears and assumptions, creating a cohesion of experiences that strengthened bonds. The call center management recognized the employees' concerns and, even without direct interventions on the issue of phenomena, added measures to increase the safety and comfort of employees during night work. However, the measures did not suspend the events. On a more tense night, a loud bang similar to a door slamming resonated through the floor, even with all doors closed and no winds. This event revived memories of old reports where similar phenomena had been experienced by other workers in the past, reinforcing the significance of the place. In an attempt to rationally explain the events, theories emerged among the workers. Some claimed the phenomena were paranormal, while others argued they were a product of accumulated stress. To ease the tension, the team adopted new tactics during shifts, ensuring that no one was left alone for long periods, a decision that brought some tranquility and decreased the occurrence of events. Months passed and supernatural activities began to decline. The shadows became less frequent and the whispers in the headphones almost disappeared, but the narrative of mystery remained alive. Carlos, upon reviewing notes, realized that even with the reduction of phenomena, his perception was permanently altered. The work environment gained a new layer of meaning and invoked respect. Despite the reduction in events, the mystery remained. Each new employee was introduced to the living legends of the place, accepted as a loving warning and a nod to oral tradition among the teams. Report 6. The Museum. In 2023, in Lisbon, Portugal, an art museum became the stage for strange events reported by one of the night security guards who worked there. The museum, famous for its vast collection of classical and modern art, is located in a charming historic building dating back to the 18th century. The architecture of the place, with its long corridors and large dimly lit rooms at night, contributed to an atmosphere of mystery and enchantment, which during the night shift took on a somewhat sinister tone. Joaquim, an experienced security guard, was assigned to the night shift after a colleague's departure. The work, at first, seemed to be a calm routine, where he made regular rounds through the galleries and corridors. Initially, everything went as expected. The activities involved checking doors, windows, and the integrity of the exhibited works. The museum, during the night, was an environment of pure silence, interrupted only by the echo of Joaquim's footsteps. Despite the tranquility, Joaquim began to notice peculiarities that he couldn't easily explain. The most intriguing of these was the perception that certain statues seemed to slightly change position between his rounds. In one of the main galleries, there were several life-sized marble statues. One of them, in particular, always seemed to be looking at a different point every time he passed by. Initially skeptical, Joaquim believed he was confused or that the repetitive night routine was playing tricks on him. He decided to ignore it, attributing the fact to his imagination and fatigue. Nevertheless, the occurrences continued and came to include paintings that inexplicably fell from the walls without any evidence of failure in the supports or air currents in the room. One incident in particular involved a Renaissance painting that had apparently been securely fixed hours before closing. Upon returning for the next round, Joaquim found it on the floor. Careful not to cause damage, he replaced the painting in its proper place, feeling an uncomfortable pang of discomfort, which he avoided sharing with other employees, fearing to appear alarmist. Besides the statues and paintings, Joaquim began to feel that the art objects on shelves and displays were also watching him. This constant feeling left him uneasy on his night rounds. The sensation was more intense in the section dedicated to African arts, where ancient masks seemed to maintain a fixed gaze, even in the dim lighting. This section became increasingly disconcerting. On a certain night, the silence of the museum was disturbed by a soft and nostalgic melody, emerging from one of the exhibition rooms, where an old grand piano was displayed as part of the collection. Joaquim, intrigued and suspicious, followed the sound to the empty room. There he found the piano silent, covered by a thin layer of dust, indicating that it had not been physically played for some time. Still, the feeling that music had recently permeated the environment did not leave Joaquim's mind. He tried to rationalize, thinking of a possible sound interference coming from outside the building. As days passed, Joaquim began to record the events in a notebook. Although he did not wish to involve his colleagues or superiors, he wanted to keep precise control of what he experienced each shift. Other nights passed, and the sounds of footsteps echoing in empty corridors began to be part of the museum's quietude. He couldn't find an origin for such sounds. One of his verification methods included cross-referencing the times of these sounds with the presence of open or closed windows, but his investigations did not result in any rational or logical cause. Seeking some comfort, during a break, Joachim began to search internet forums and discussions on platforms like Reddit, where he found surprisingly similar reports. In these reports, museum employees in other parts of the world narrated experiences of inexplicable events during their night shifts, involving objects apparently coming to life. This reading brought some relief to Joachim, who came to understand that perhaps the manifestations were not exclusive to his workplace, and that he was not alone in this surreal experience. Talking with colleagues outside the work environment also seemed to corroborate the idea that old places, like that museum, carried their own history marked by unique events. The skepticism of some colleagues kept the issue in unofficial secrecy among the security guards. Only a few shared Joachim's same uneasiness about what might be happening. As Joachim's routine continued, the inexplicable manifestations remained regular, but never became hostile or caused significant damage to the artworks. Even so, the discomfort remained present. In an attempt to clear his mind, Joachim adopted the habit of conducting his rounds more frequently and constantly changing routes. For him, these shifts gained a new emotional meaning, a mixture of apprehension and novelty, as if each night brought the expectation that something could manifest at any time. Certain nights, although rare, passed without any occurrence, and, in a way, left Joachim even more apprehensive, as if the museum was saving something for subsequent nights. Eventually, other employees, perhaps inspired by Joachim's experiences, began to pay more attention to their surroundings, noticing small events that would have previously gone unnoticed. However, Joachim was never attached to hasty conclusions or supernatural explanations. For him, the mystery was just part of the museum's charm, something that challenged his understanding without needing labels. Report 7. The Cemetery. In 2016, an old cemetery in a remote village in Yorkshire, England, became known for mysterious reports and peculiar events that intrigued local residents and occasional visitors. The cemetery, surrounded by century-old trees and time-worn stone walls, was a resting place for generations of village inhabitants. Its remote and silent atmosphere only accentuated the mystery that surrounded it. John, a night watchman in charge of protecting and caring for the place, was familiar with the almost palpable quietude of the cemetery. He had worked there for several years, always accompanied by the incessant wind that blew between the tombstones. On a particularly calm night, while making his rounds, John began to hear whispers that seemed to emanate from the ground, between the gray and worn gravestones. Initially, he attributed these sounds to the wind or small nocturnal animals that inhabited the surroundings. However, the whispers persisted, becoming clearer and closer as days passed. John was a practical man, little inclined to superstitions, but he couldn't ignore the sounds that became a constant part of his nights. Apparently, it was as if ancient voices were trying to communicate. As he approached a more isolated area of the cemetery, he observed small lights floating between the tombs, blinking softly before disappearing into the darkness. Intrigued, John stopped to observe. The lights resembled distant candles, flickering in the wind, yet they floated at inexplicable levels, apparently without origin. Over the weeks, these events became increasingly common. John mentally documented these occurrences, often dialoguing with his faithful dog, the only companion on his solitary night vigils. One night, while performing his usual round, John felt an unmistakable presence walking behind him. A chill ran down his spine when he heard firm footsteps that matched his own. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The gravel ground remained untouched, as if he were the only living soul present at that moment. A feeling of constant vigilance set in, as if invisible eyes were observing his every move. This made John increase his state of alertness, attentive to everything around him. Local legend claimed that the cemetery was haunted by the spirits of those buried there, something that most villagers associated with stories told around campfires to scare children. Despite normally ignoring such stories, John began to consider the legends from a new perspective, although he remained skeptical about supernatural phenomena. During one of his night watches, he encountered a group of curious teenagers prowling the cemetery, possibly attracted by the stories circulating about the place. John gently shooed them away, explaining that the mysterious events were not for pranks or challenges. The safety and peace of the place should be respected, he said. The young people, still impressed by the stories, promised not to return. One of them mentioned having seen the same floating lights, confirming John's experience. After this encounter, John began to talk more frequently about his experiences, but only in forums and social networks dedicated to paranormal events. In online reports and discussions, he discovered that other people around the world also observed similar phenomena, which helped to legitimize what he was experiencing. These exchanges of information served as a relief for John, who realized he was not alone in his experiences and that many dealt with similar situations. The lonely nights in the cemetery became a little more bearable, knowing that in other parts of the world, other watchmen and night observers shared his curiosity and apprehension. However, the whispers continued, as did the lights and sensations of being watched. John adjusted his routines, trying not to ignore the signs he perceived, but never letting himself be dominated by fear. In moments of introspection, during his breaks, he contemplated the relationship between the past of those resting there and his present vigil, a silent but constant link. The seasons changed, bringing with them new sounds and silhouettes to the cemetery. But the inexplicable phenomena remained, almost defying the passage of time. Some nights were relatively quiet, and during these moments, John reflected on the events he witnessed and how the place seemed to have a life of its own. There was always an expectation of finding something new around the corner of an unknown wing of the cemetery, where nature and silence reigned supreme. In conversations with the few daytime visitors, John rarely mentioned his experiences. He preferred that the cemetery be perceived as a place of memory and respect. However, rumors grew among the villages, and the cemetery began to attract more curious people during the day. Some were interested in the stories, while others sought to capture the lights with their cameras. Despite the growing interest, John maintained his discreet posture, ensuring that order and silence were always respected, regardless of individual beliefs.